Okay, let's dive right into this explainer. Everyone thinks they know the story of Disco Demolition Night, but let me tell you, right beneath the surface of this massive historical spectacle hides a bizarre sociological and musical iceberg. Seriously, it's wild. The reality of what actually went down that night and the literal classical weaponry used to orchestrate it, well, it reveals a fascinating story about how culture, media, and music actually work. So, we're going to start our journey right at the explosive peak of the whole spectacle. Picture this: shock jock Steve Dahl, wearing this comically too small combat helmet and an oversized army jacket, just screaming to a massive, totally frenzied crowd. This is now officially the world's largest anti-disco rally. Disco sucks, right? But you have to wonder, how on earth did a radio DJ end up looking like a general leading a literal war against a music genre? Well, to set the scene, it's July 12th, 1979, at Comiskey Park in Chicago. It is a sweltering summer evening. The air is literally thick with the smell of burning vinyl, gunpowder, and cheap beer at a fateful White Sox versus Detroit Tigers baseball doubleheader. Now, the White Sox are desperate to attract fans that season, so they authorized a quirky promotion just to put bodies in the seats. And, well, they definitely got them, just absolutely not in the way they ever intended. The whole thing kicked off with a crazy low ticket price. Get this, just 98 cents. The deal, engineered by young White Sox executive Mike Veeck, was super simple. You bring a disco record to the stadium to be blown up between games, and boom, you get in for under $1. A local radio station, WLUP, known as The Loop, had been heavily promoting this Disco Demolition Night to its dedicated rock and roll audience. Veeck and the organizers, they figured, okay, maybe we'll get 20,000 people, maybe 35,000 on the extremely high end. Yeah, no. Instead, over 50,000 fans flooded the stadium, and there were tens of thousands more milling around outside who couldn't even get in. And let's be real, they weren't there for the baseball. They were there to celebrate the absolute destruction of disco music, fueled by all that cheap beer and the restless anticipation of a giant explosion. 39. That is the number of arrests made after this crowd totally morphed into a destructive force. When the explosion finally happened, it was huge. It ripped a massive crater right into the outfield grass. But the chaos didn't stop there. Thousands of fans literally vaulted the fences and stormed the field. They're tearing up the turf, setting secondary fires, literally stealing the bases and destroying the batting cages, the whole shebang. They actually had to call in riot police just to clear the stadium. The escalation here was just breathtaking. At 8:40 p.m., Steve Dahl rolls up in a military jeep. Just minutes later, this massive crate of records is detonated, and fans immediately swarm the field, setting fires everywhere. It took riot police over half an hour to finally clear the chaos, and the field was so badly trashed that the White Sox actually had to forfeit the second game to the Tigers. So yeah, it escalated from a wacky radio stunt to a full-blown riot that forced a historic American League Baseball forfeit. All right, moving into part one, rock's anti-disco army and the classical secret weapon. Let's see what was happening behind the scenes. To really understand this chaos, we have to look at the man who orchestrated the whole thing. Steve Dahl was this rock purist who had been fired when his previous radio station abruptly flipped an all-disco format. He took that resentment and channeled it into a mock military crusade against what he saw as a plastic corporate takeover of radio. So he forms this listener group called the Insane Coholips, Anti-Disco Army. By rocking military fatigues, he deliberately cultivated this hyper-masculine rebellion, basically framing rock as authentic and disco as this manufactured, dehumanizing conformity. But here is the absolute absurdity of Dahl's secret weapon. When he marched out to center field to blow up those records, he didn't blast a heavy metal guitar riff for some hard rock anthem. Nope. He used in 19th century military brass march by John Philip Sousa to sonically combat 120 beat-per-minute electronic synthesizers. It's wild to think about. On one hand, you have disco, right? Fluid, electronic, totally designed for late-night clubs. On the other, you have Sousa, rigid, acoustic, and designed for daytime patriotic parades. So, by blasting these highly ordered traditional American marches over the stadium PA, specifically the Washington Post march on his radio show and the Stars and Stripes Forever at the stadium, the promoters were drawing this stark, incredibly ironic line in the sand. They were quite literally using the 19th century March King to rhetorically kill the 1970s disco empire. It was this brilliant classical counterstrike that pitted traditional, disciplined American music against what the rock crowd saw as a synthetic, over-commercialized invasion. Let's transition to part two, deeper cultural fault lines. We're going a layer deeper here. Because our sources revealed that this wasn't just some friendly argument over musical taste. Not at all. Cultural historians point out that disco actually originated as a safe, liberated space for marginalized communities. It was pioneered in underground dance scenes by Black, Latino, and gay communities as a refuge away from mainstream judgment. Disco promoted very fluid expressions of masculinity, fashion, and choreography. So once disco blew up and hit the massive commercial mainstream, this fluidity posed a direct contrast, and honestly, for some, a threat to the traditional hyper-masculine rock crowd. In fact, historians argue that the disco sucks movement functioned largely as a defense mechanism. It was a messy collision of class resentment, racial anxiety, and simmering homophobia. Rock purists felt their authentic cultural dominance was slipping away, and that stadium riot, it was just a highly visible, explosive manifestation of those deep, simmering cultural fissures that were running right beneath the American mainstream. Okay, moving on to part 3, the rhetorical death of disco. Let's look at how this is processed academically. So, how does history actually process a cultural death? Well, there's this really fascinating paper in the Maxi Journal that uses the theories of French philosopher Jean Baudrillard to argue something pretty profound. They argue that the literal death of disco never actually took place. The genre didn't just up and drop dead on July 12, 1979. Rather, the idea of its death was artificially and rhetorically constructed. And this brings us right to Baudrillard's concept of hyperreality. It's essentially a state where the media seamlessly blends reality and fiction until you literally can't tell the difference anymore. The media projected these intense images of burning records and riot police so heavily that the simulation of a war against disco actually became more real to the general public than the music itself. In academic terms, they call this a non-event. Now, that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Obviously, a field was destroyed, but it means it was an event designed specifically to happen for the cameras. Think about it. Steve Dahl even told the crowd they'd be on the news all over the country. They literally manufactured a highly publicized spectacle to cement this narrative that disco is dead, ultimately validating a reactionary crowd's desire to erase a marginalized culture. Now for part 4. An unintended musical legacy. What actually happened after the smoke cleared? Well, corporately, the aftermath was brutal. Record labels absolutely panicked and started dropping disco artists left and right. Radio formats practically got whiplash, pivoting back to rock and the emerging new wave. But here's the thing. The music didn't die. It was simply forced back underground. Those incredible rhythmic innovations of disco went right back to the Black and gay clubs in cities like Chicago and Detroit, where DJs just kept experimenting. And down there, it actively mutated into the enduring foundational sounds of modern house and techno music. It's an incredible legacy. You know, there's a great saying, old things have value when new things get noisy. The profound irony of this whole saga is that while disco had to be completely reinvented out of the ashes just to survive, John Philip Sousa's classical marches made it through the riot entirely unscathed. In fact, performances of Sousa marches actually jumped 40% that summer. It perfectly proves that traditional, established assets often endure cultural panics, acting as a sort of shield for people who feel like the dominant paradigm is just shifting way too fast. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider the cyclical nature of cultural backlash. We've just seen exactly how media spectacle and the fear of something new can rhetorically destroy a genre. So ask yourself, what future sounds or new cultural movements will we fear next? And when we do, what traditional weapons will we reach for to fight them?